In this screencast, we'll combine EventSentry's file monitoring functionality, which notifies you when files are changed, added, or removed from a directory, and EventSentry's process action, which allows you to launch any process, any executable based on events, to automatically compress files that are added to a directory. When we think about EventSentry, we usually think about log monitoring, system health monitoring, network monitoring, and so forth. But you can do a lot more things with EventSentry and really tie together some features to create some pretty interesting things and automate certain tasks. In this example, we'll also be utilizing insertion strings in events to make all this magic here happen of automatically compressing files that are added to a folder. This is, of course, just a theoretical example. Windows obviously includes the ability to automatically compress files and folders, but there's a lot of other things you could do in reaction to files being added to a folder. For example, moving them to a different drive, compressing them, uploading them to an FTP or SSH server, and so forth, and a variety of other things. And since all the features that I'm utilizing in this demo here are available in the free light edition as well, you can achieve any of this in the light version of EventSentry as well. So here's what we have set up. I have a directory called cfile monitoring, and this is actually left over from a previous screencast. And what we're going to do is we're going to compress any file that we're adding to this folder and automatically create an archive in this zip subfolder in there. And what we're utilizing in addition to EventSentry is a command line utility to compress files called a 7-zip. 7-zip includes a command line utility called 7z.exe, and if you just execute it, you'll see the command line options. Creating an archive from the command line is actually quite straightforward. You simply call 7z with the switch, which in this particular case add files to an archive. We'll have an archive name, for example test.zip, and we'll create an archive of any particular file, for example 7z.exe. So that's the entire syntax that's needed to create an archive from the command line with 7-zip. So let's jump right here into our EventSentry management console. So the first thing we want to start off with is creating an action that will launch 7-zip and compress the file. So we'll go to the action container here, click add, we'll create a process action, we'll call it compress file, and we're presented with the action dialog here. The first thing here is we'll browse for the 7-zip installation folder, which in this particular case is in program files. Now we're going to actually pick the one from the 64-bit directory here, because but it's very important since the EventSentry agent at the time of this screencast is a 32-bit process. You will have to install the 32-bit version of 7-zip in order to get this working. We specify program files here. Windows will automatically redirect this to the x86 program files directory. And we'll start with the arguments here. The first argument that we'll have is going to be A for adding files to an archive, and the next argument is going to be the archive name. We're going to make this flexible, so we're not going to hard code any folders in here, but instead we're going to use insertion strings, and I will explain those insertion strings in a second. But the event that's created by EventSentry when a file is added to a folder will include the folder name and the file name, among other things, of the file that was added to the folder. And the folder name is going to be stored in the first insertion string, and the file name is going to be in the second insertion string. So this really represents folder and file name here. But since we want to add it to an archive with the zip extension, we're going to just simply append zip here, and the files that we want to add, well, the file that we want to add to this archive is just going to be the same thing. folder and file. Now file names may contain spaces, so we're going to have to enclose everything here within quotes as a first step here. And you can always check down there for the actual current syntax that's going to be executed by EventSentry. But of course, we want to add the file into a zip subfolder of the actual directory where the file is being added to. So we'll simply insert zip in here, and we'll have the complete syntax here. So we're moving it to the existing folder, but into the subfolder with the zip extension. And then finally, what are we adding to the archive? It's the folder /file. So this looks a bit cryptic, but the $str variable here is what EventSentry allows you to use if you want to utilize an insertion string from an event. So what are these insertion strings, and how do we know which insertion string to use? We got the EventSentry Management Console as well as the NT Toolkit include the event message browser. Okay, so before we do that, let's take a quick look here and let's go to the event viewer. When EventSentry logs an event indicating that a file has been added, it logs this particular event here, 12.202, and here we have the first example of such an event. Here, the EventSentry GUI log file was added to the C file monitoring directory. And like explained before, the directory is going to be $str1, the file is going to be $str2 because it's the second insertion string. How can we verify that? Very easily. We'll go to Tools, Utilities, Event Message Browser. EventSentry is registered in the application event log. We click EventSentry here, and here we'll just enter the event number, which is 12.202. If we click it, we'll see the actual definition, the template, if you will, of this event. A file has been added to monitor directory. Insertion string number 1 is the directory. Insertion string number 2 is the file. And of course, there are others too that you can utilize if you want to. In our example, we're just going to utilize these two, number 1 and number 2. As I mentioned earlier, in order to use those insertion strings in EventSentry, you can use the $str variable appended followed by the number of the insertion string. So here it makes a little bit more sense. Now we're getting the directory, appending a /, appending zip for the subdirectory, and then appending the file name again with the zip appended to it. So let's look at this one more time. So this is going to be the folder name, C file monitoring /zip. Then whatever the file name would be, test.exe. The zip file name is going to be simply have .zip appended to it, so we can distinguish between an archive and the actual file. And then finally, simply the file that's going to be added to the archive. So that's easy enough. So that's an action. So if we call this action with the correct event, then it will launch 7-zip and compress the file. So, but now we need to still tell EventSentry to when to launch this compress file action. In order to do this, we're going to create a new package. So it's going to be an event rule because everything is in EventSentry is triggered based off events. So we're going to hit add here, and we're just going to call file. We'll call it automatic file compression. We're going to make this package global. And to make our life a little bit easier, so we could now go to the ribbon here, add an include filter, and specify everything manually. But since we already have the event, we're just going to go here to the application event log, find the right event, which is this one here, right-click the event, we're going to say add include filter. We're going to give it a name, compress file. There's a lot of duplicate names here. And pick the package, automatic file compression, and hit OK. So EventSentry automatically created everything exactly how we need it. Include filter application event log is a warning event, source category event ID. Now we need to specify an action. In this particular case, since it's alphabetical, compress file is already selected, so we'll add that. So at this point, what would happen is any file that's going to be added to any directory on this machine would be compressed into a zip subfolder. Now, we may not want that. We may have file monitoring set up on system directories and so forth. So we may want to restrict this a little bit more. And this is where the content filters come in. So we're going to narrow this down a little bit and say, you know what, let's only apply this filter to files that are added to this directory here, C file monitoring. How do we do that? We're going to utilize those insertion strings again. Insertion string match, insertion string number 2, so this is going to be the same as the $str1 variable, matches, and we'll simply write file monitoring here. Text here is not case sensitive. And if you're not sure about which insertion string to use, you can also hit the preview button here, and this will fire up the event message browser right away again and show you the template of the event. So this is good. Now, got to be a bit careful here. If we add a zip file to the directory, then we probably do not want to compress it, because that could potentially create an endless loop. So what we're going to do, in addition to looking for the C file monitoring directory, we're going to say let's only compress files that don't have the zip extension. So we're going to go back down to the insertion string match again. This time we're going to match the file name, and we're going to say $star.zip would of course match any zip file, but we don't want that, so we're going to invert that with the exclamation point. So if you put the exclamation point in front of a filter, it will invert it. And now that we have more than one content filters in here, EventSentry asks us how we should chain those different filters, and we of course want to AND those filters. This ensures that both conditions will have to be matched in order for the filter to match and to trigger the compress file action that we've set up earlier. So that's all we needed to do. So we have a rule in place. If a file gets added to this directory, it matches and only to the C file monitoring directory. If it doesn't end with the zip extension, then we'll trigger the compress file action. So let's save the configuration and let's try this out and see if this actually works. As I mentioned in the other screencasts here, whenever you save the configuration, you want to briefly wait for the 1035 event that's logged by EventSentry, indicating that the new configuration has been picked up. And here we have the 1035 event. Quick verification will show that the automatic file compression package here is available. So let's give this a try. Let's go to the Windows directory here and let's just grab that Windows Update log file. We'll copy it and we'll put it into the file monitoring directory here. We'll wait a little bit, and there it is, automatically compressed. Windows Update log.zip. If you look at it, we've got the Windows log file in there. Happened pretty much in just a few seconds. File monitoring is done in real time, so the only delay you'll have really is the execution, the invocation of the process, and the actual compression of the file. But let's try this with another file. Let's take here we have a log file from the management console. We'll copy this here, copy it in here, take a look at the zip file, zip folder I mean, and there it is, compressed and ready within just a couple of seconds. Now let's make sure it doesn't work the other way. Let's copy the file, the zip file here, into the file monitoring folder and make sure we don't get another zipped version of it. And it works as expected. It's not picking up that file because it's been excluded due to the zip extension that it has. So we can delete that file again. So as you can see, it was pretty straightforward to do this. All we did was create an action here that calls 7-zip with the correct parameters, and since the file monitoring event in EventSentry is nicely divided into folder and file name as different values, it was pretty easy to do this. Otherwise, we'd probably need to use some sort of a a Perl Python script to accomplish the same thing. And that's, of course, something else you can do. If you want to do more advanced things with EventSentry, you don't have to necessarily invoke the actual compression, executable, or whatever else it is directly. You can write a short script and have the script do some of the logic if that's necessary. But other than that, we just created a package that looks for the particular event, filtered it down, narrowed it down so that it only applies to the files that are relevant, and everything is set up. Let us know if you find a creative way to utilize EventSentry in your environment and automate some of your IT tasks. And also don't forget to check out some of our other screencasts. Thank you for watching.